Hi, my name's Professor Susie Lon Castle. I'm from California State University, San Marcos, the Literature and Writing Studies Department, and an affiliate in the Ethnic Studies program. The title of this talk is The Akwin Family and the Rise and Fall of San Diego's Chinese Mission Schools. I have an article on this topic forthcoming in the Journal of San Diego History, and this talk was originally sponsored by the San Diego History Center and the Chinese Historical Society and Museum here in San Diego. I've also filed an addendum with a full timeline and references with the San Diego History Center archives, if you'd like those references. Okay, let me go ahead and share my screen. Here in California, we often talk about the Catholic missions. We talk about the Franciscans and the way that they brought 21 missions starting from south, going to north, having missions almost every 30 miles apart. In fact, we teach about these missions in 4th grade so that almost every elementary student knows an awful lot about the Catholic missions here in California. But almost no one ever talks about a very different kind of mission, the Protestant Chinese missions. And there were hundreds of them. There were 4 main Protestant denominations involved: the Presbyterians, the Congregationalists, the Baptists, and the Methodists. And their efforts were just incredibly energetic. In virtually every Western town that had 50 to 100 Chinese and a Protestant church, there was at least 1 or 2 Chinese mission schools. In large Chinatowns like San Francisco and Oakland, even Sacramento, there were multiple denominations involved. And as we'll see in this talk, even in a small Chinatown like San Diego that never officially had more than 1,000 people, we still had 4 different Protestant denominations here setting up almost a dozen different Chinese mission schools and homes. My talk today wants to focus on the development, the movement and development of those mission homes over time. And I'd like to suggest that in each city, the conglomerate of mission homes really had a sense of its own character, right? So for instance, in San Francisco, advocacy for Chinese seemed to be one of the major goals of the whole set of Chinese Protestant missions in San Francisco. In Santa Barbara, by contrast, they were much more interested in collaborating with businesses to help Chinese assimilate in order to fight off some of the anti-Chinese leagues in Santa Barbara at the time. And in San Diego, it was really about following the boom and the bust of the railroad. So the Chinese missions were really struggling to keep alive after the railroad bust, but they were really trying to grow in anticipation of what they thought would be a much, much larger Chinese community. So my point in this is that the Chinese mission homes, the Chinese movement, really did flow organically. The Protestants really were trying to develop the kinds of things they thought Chinese in those local situations really needed the most. And sometimes we see very unexpected outcomes. I come to this work through my own work on the Akwin Diaries. And for those who don't know, the Akwin Diaries are a set of 11 personal narratives, diary volumes, written by this man, Dam Akwin, who lived in San Diego for the second half of his life. His diaries were passed down through his generations to the San Diego Historical Society, where they remain one of the most significant holdings. And I'd like to suggest that they are perhaps the most significant writings in English by a Chinese immigrant to America prior to 1900. Akwin was a member of the Chinese missions in San Francisco. In fact, he attended all 5 of them. And when he came down to San Diego, he was also, as you'll see, a very important member here. So the story of Chinese Protestant missions in America begins in China, and it begins early. We know that British missionary Robert Morrison was already in China in the early 1800s, proselytizing as part of a movement called the Second Great Awakening, right? A worldwide evangelical movement in order to convert people to Christianity. American missionary Peter Parker joined Robert Morrison in China in the early 1830s. And after both Opium Wars, Peter Parker had a very unique connection to the presidents of the United States, Presidents Tyler and Adams at the time. His wife was a relative, I think a cousin, of Secretary of State Daniel Webster. So after the two Opium Wars, Peter Parker individually went to American presidents Tyler and Adams and appealed to them on behalf of their work on the unequal treaties that settled both Opium Wars, appealed to allow greater access to missionaries inside of China, because China was not only the largest nation on earth at the time, something like 400 million people, but it was also officially closed to other nations. Peter Parker's request was granted, a very unusual request, I think, at the end of the war. And as a result, we can say that China experienced after the Opium Wars not only an economic and imperial invasion, but also arguably a spiritual invasion. As you can see from this map, the Protestant mission stations in China proliferated, so that by 1866, there were literally hundreds of them. You can see all of these cities in red had these these missions, and even these underlined in black down here on the coast were also additional sites of missions in China. The problem is that there was xenophobia on both sides, from Westerners towards Chinese, as well as from Chinese towards Westerners. And it was not just xenophobia, it was also distrust. American missionary Peter Parker, for instance, was a medical missionary. His specialty was ophthalmology, and he set up an ophthalmic hospital there in China where he was doing a lot of good work operating on eyes and helping people to see better. The problem is that Western medicine seemed fairly barbaric to the Chinese. And you can see here, this is a resistance cartoon. Down here in the bottom lower corner, you can see, I've tried to highlight it, but it's a little bit blurry. You can see two Western-looking men operating on a Chinese, and it looks like they're removing his eye. And you can see again, the cartoon is titled organ snatching. So there's a really derogatory connotation to this. This is not healing. This is like stealing an organ, like really harming this man. And you can see in the cartoon below that it looks like someone is taking the eye and then escaping with it. The caption that went along with this cartoon originally reads like this. There's three different phrases. The first phrase says, "The foreign ghosts give the light that we are not looking for." And here, foreign ghost was a derogatory term for Westerners. The light, obviously a metaphor for Christianity. So the foreign ghosts are giving light that we are not looking for. So the Chinese don't want it. At least a portion of the Chinese don't want it. Second phrase, "The pig wants to cut out our eyes." And I think that's pretty self-explanatory. Another derogatory term for Americans. And the final phrase, "Then let it be an eye for an eye." This is a call to arms, right? This is a call to protest. So we see here, even before the 1900 Boxer Rebellion, that there is a movement against Christians in China, an anti-missionary, anti-Western movement. And it was rhetoric that was across the popular press. Western missionaries who were in China were frustrated, not only by the lack of conversions, but also by an unfamiliar lifestyle. And sometimes, as you can see from this cartoon, to direct threats to their safety. At the same time, they were beginning to hear about the gold rush, and they were beginning to see Chinese immigrants with a great enthusiasm to travel to the Gumsan, to the Gold Mountain. And their predictions were right. In 1860, 35,000 Chinese went to America. In 1870, it doubled, right? Almost 63,000 were in America. And by 1880, about 105,000 Chinese were in America. Now, the missionaries knew that Chinese were intending to go to America for only a short time, that they were going to work for 3 to 5 years, and then they had every intention of returning home. So the missionaries saw that there might in fact be an excellent opportunity to proselytize, to missionize to Chinese in America, with the expectation that those who would convert would return to China and spread the good word again as part of this second great awakening to the largest nation on earth in terms of its population. So several missionary denominations, several Protestant denominations went to their national headquarters, and they went to the foreign mission branches of their national headquarters and asked whether they could set up missions in San Francisco, where the Chinese were landing, right? The port of San Francisco was the only open port for the Pacific travel. And the national headquarters said yes. So this is why the heads of Protestant churches inside these Chinese missions are called missionaries rather than pastors. The most important ones were these two men on the bottom left. On the far left, we have Augustus Loomis, who was from the Presbyterian Church, and to his side, Reverend William Spear. Reverend William Spear was the founder. Both of these men were missionaries in China before they became missionaries in Chinatown, San Francisco. Up to the upper right here, we have Reverend William Pond, who is from the Congregational Church, and to his left here in the upper left-hand corner, we have Reverend Otis Gibson from the Methodist Church. And Pond tells us very famously, we bait the gospel hook with the English alphabet. And what he meant by that is that these missionaries from China thought that the best way they could approach missionizing, proselytizing to Chinese in America was the same way they did in China, and that was through English language lessons. The idea is that it would be difficult to read the Bible if they couldn't speak English first. So they set up first just hundreds, literally maybe even 1,000 different English classes across California mostly, but also in some Western states, with the intent to teach the English language as kind of a loss leader, if I can use that grocery store metaphor. They could attract as many people as they could to free English language classes, and then they could build upon those classes in order eventually to teach scripture. And that's exactly what they did. They even made their own curriculum materials, and I'll get to that in just a minute. But these Chinese schools, as you can see, sometimes took very traditional classroom forms. As we see, this is one of the two Chinese mission schools that catered especially to Chinese women. And this happens to be the Methodist one, the Otis Gibson Church. But they didn't only take form in these traditional classroom spaces. Often they were in the living rooms of missionaries or missionary volunteers. They could be in rented facilities. They could be in church synagogues. They really were ephemeral. They rose anywhere there was enough people who wanted to be taught and someone who was willing to teach. And they traveled along around town an awful lot so that they can be very, very difficult to track in government and other official records. They were offered as many as every night of the week, with special services for Sunday school on Sundays. And the classes were generally small, somewhere between 6 and 20, but again, they could really vary depending upon the location. And now I can tell you a little bit about the materials. They wrote their own curriculum. This is the English and Chinese book from Reverend Loomis, and probably Aquin studied from this very book. He studied under Reverend Loomis. In fact, Reverend Loomis officiated at his wedding. He knew him well, and Aquin knew, in fact, all of the missionaries in San Francisco pretty well. But this particular book shows the approach that they took to teaching the English language. First, they would do a lot of penmanship, and you can see in the upper right-hand corner here, the alphabet in all of its versions, right? Cursive, lower letter. And then they would go on to teach 2-letter words, 3-letter words, 4-letter words, phrases, and then eventually theological lessons in scripture. And again, you can look at some of these phrases. Some of them seem like they make sense, right? Here's the picture, an ox, my ox, an axe, to differentiate between an ox and an axe. But some of them are a little bit more odd. You know, go up, go so, go on. Again, I'd like to know what current linguists think about these this particular approach to teaching the English language. You can see here, it's not until lesson 24 that they begin teaching theology. Right? We have fear the Lord, draw nigh to him, and a whole selection of vocabulary to go along with it. The bottom of this page has all of these phrases in Chinese characters, so that, again, the whole book is bilingual. Let me turn your attention to the far right hand of this photograph. You see a piano. So most of the school lessons began and ended with singing hymns, right, and telling stories. This person on the right in Western dress was probably what was referred to as the native teacher or the native assistant. He was probably a Christian Chinese, someone who had already converted, and who was probably being paid for his time to assist as a translator and a teacher in each of these church missions. So you can see that the students are in more traditional dress, but the native teacher or the native assistant often took more Western dress. Let's see. In San Diego, those of you who know the history of San Diego know that San Diego began with fishing villages, Chinese fishing villages. So that at Ballast Point, there was one that had only about 2 or 3 Chinese houses. And then in Roseville and La Playa, a much larger Chinese fishing community developed where there were almost a dozen shacks or houses at one time, but they also had drying racks. They had a boat building facility, a junk boat, specifically the name of the Chinese boats, a junk boat facility where they were building ships, and they had tanks where they could salt the smaller fish that were caught and then dry them and export them. Over here on the other side of San Diego Bay in so-called Newtown was the third and largest Chinatown. This was the more formal Chinatown in what was called Horton's Addition. And this is the place, the third area, where the Chinese mission homes developed. On this map, you can see that this is the grid of downtown San Diego, the current downtown San Diego, which was also called the Newtown or the Horton's Addition section of San Diego prior to the 1900s. And you can see here the fishing village is right off about 3rd Avenue or so. And it is no surprise, it is no coincidence that Chinatown developed right up from the fishing villages, because the first Chinese stores were import-export stores to help export the abalone that was found here in the Baja Coast and that was dried here in San Diego and that was exported to San Francisco and then on to China. It was really the kind of black gold. It was black abalone. They called it black gold because it was the primary harvest that was able to really bring a lot of Chinese fishermen down and really help to establish our early Chinatowns here. So in 1870, we had about 70 Chinese fishermen, as well as a handful of Chinese who worked in agriculture and a few who worked in the service industry, who worked as cooks, who worked as servants, who maybe worked in hotels, and then laundries and restaurants. And at that time, the very first Chinese mission school was announced in the paper. It was May 1st, 1880, and it was a Presbyterian mission school. What's really interesting about this is that the new pastor had only come to town about a month before, and they didn't even have a church facility yet. So the immediate enthusiasm, the immediate interest in beginning to educate Chinese on the English language and then on Christian scripture came, again, almost immediately. They didn't have a church, so they met at a rental hall called Horton Hall, and that was on 6th and F Street, so just a few blocks from this Chinatown, so Chinese could easily walk there and then come back. And Elizabeth McPhail, a local historian who wrote an early article about the Chinese missions, surmises that there were probably children in this first Chinese mission school, but I think she's probably wrong. The demographic here were Chinese men. So I believe it was probably a handful of Chinese men, likely from the fishing and agricultural and service industries, who attended this very first Chinese mission school. The trace then goes dark for about 15 years, with very, very few mentions, if any at all, except that we learn a lot about those 15 years from Aquin's diary. McPhail would have you believe, and the conventional wisdom is there was only one Chinese mission in San Diego. But what I found in the last few years is that there were, in fact, probably five. And they took these different stages of development. So they began in the early days in the living rooms of missionaries' homes. Then there was a period of joint mission schools between the congregation, the Congregational and the Presbyterians, and then a huge moment of growth and diversity, a booming along with the railroad boom, and then a bust, a decline after the railroad bust. So let's look at those four stages as a way to understand the growth of the Chinese mission school movement here in San Diego. And I believe that this is probably representative of other suburban mission homes as well, the development of mission homes in other cities as well. So in 1870, I mentioned there was one meeting that showed up in the newspaper. And again, it almost went dark, except we find in Aquin's diary in 1878, roughly right the middle of this 15-year period, 14-year period. In 1878, Aquin writes about going with many boys to Mr. Marston's house for school for 1 hour. Now, if you know anything about local Chinese San Diego history, you know that George Marston was one of the great founders and developers of early San Diego. He was a philanthropist. He was a department store owner. He was, in fact, the founder and president of the San Diego History Center and a great developer of Balboa Park, among many other things. He was also a member of both the Presbyterian as well as the Congregational churches, and he served as the vice president of one of the first Chinese missions here in San Diego. So it's not really a surprise in that context that the Chinese went to his home, because again, the churches were not yet built. So they went to Mr. Marston's house for an hour of Chinese school where they were learning the English language. And what we learned from Aquin's diary in October of 1878 is he hadn't moved here yet. He was, in fact, between jobs, and he was looking for a job. And he had a lot of friends here who also had the last name Tom. His last name was Tom or Ham or Tom, right? And so we know that San Diego at the time for Chinese was a Ham town, just like in Guangdong in China, a lot of the villages take the surname of the major family group in that particular village. So there are Han villages, there are Wang villages, there are Chan villages, there are Liang villages. Well, San Diego for Chinese was a Han town. And even though Aquin probably couldn't trace his specific biological relationship to some of these men that he was befriending, they all felt like family, and he called them his relations. And he very much wanted to move down here to be in a closer, more intimate group. So it seems as though he came to San Diego with the intent of interviewing for potentially a mission home job, maybe as a native teacher. He comes down, he gets off the ship, he gets a haircut, and then he goes immediately to meet with Reverend Gates, who is the Baptist pastor here in San Diego. And it's kind of curious. You're like, how does he know this person? He gets off the boat and he, kind of walks over to his house. Well, the background is that Reverend Chetwood was Reverend Gates' predecessor, and he had moved to Santa Barbara. And Aquin was living in Santa Barbara at the Chinese mission home there, where he probably met this Reverend Chetwood. And this Reverend Chetwood probably told him about Reverend Gates and in some ways served as an introductory liaison. So Aquin gets off the boat, he gets a haircut, he goes to meet with Reverend Gates, chats for a little bit, maybe an hour, and then Reverend Gates takes him to go meet with the other Protestant church leaders, including George Marston. So within the space of just a few hours, he lands in San Diego and he is meeting with some of the most important leaders of the Protestant community here in San Diego at the time. And what we find from that is that they had a very collaborative environment among them, right? Reverend Gates is taking him to meet with these other pastors. He's not just keeping Aquin for himself, as it were. And we learn from Aquin that there is, in fact, a thriving Chinese mission home community from two denominations, from the Baptists as well as the Presbyterians. So on Friday nights, Aquin goes to George Marston's house, and George Marston's wife, Mrs. Marston, teaches, in this case, these 8 boys or so. On Sunday nights, they went to Reverend Gates' house, the Baptist minister, and he's taught by their wives. The boys are taught by Reverend Gates' wives. On Sunday mornings, Aquin is going to each of the Protestant churches in turn, and on the days he's living in one of his friends' laundries, and he's helping to wash and hang up laundry. So he's very, very active for an entire month with the Protestant Chinese mission community. And he tells us all about giving guest presentations in one or another, church meeting. He also tells us that on several occasions he was asked to actually teach the lesson. So here we are. On this date, he tells us the supper's at 6, and with 8 boys go to Mrs. Gates' house for school because she want me to preach the word to our boys, and Mrs. Marston is there, and they please. So you can see that he is excited, I think, to be sharing some of his lessons with some of the Chinese boys that he's hanging out with, and he's really kind of excited that the 2 missionary women are supporting his efforts. Now, this is a really interesting time. It could not have been easy to have Chinese men in your house in the 1870s. In 1878 in particular, Dennis Kearney has riled up his working men's group, and they've gone to the California Constitution Convention, and they have succeeded in convincing those representatives to change the California Constitution to include a number of different discriminatory measures against the Chinese, including the fact that they can't work for the government, right? Several years earlier, in 1871, there was a massacre in Los Angeles where 19 Chinese were lynched, including a 14-year-old boy. In 1877, just a year before Aquin's visit, there are riots in San Francisco against the Chinese. And just around the corner in 1882 will be the Chinese Exclusion Act. So this is not an easy moment to be fraternizing, if you will, to be teaching and talking to Chinese boys, certainly not having them inside your home and close to your women. And yet Protestants did this, and they did it with courage, and they did it with earnestness. I'd like to believe that they were some of the few who could see directly through the disinformation and the propaganda that called Chinese yellow perils and considered them some kind of a threat. I'd like to believe that the Protestants saw in them human beings like everyone else, and saw them as earnest contributors to America's infrastructure, and with that same earnestness wanted to help bring their religion to the Chinese with the hopes that the Chinese would bring them back to China. Okay. Aquin does not get the job as a native teacher, despite being impressive to the women here. He isn't offered a job and goes back to San Francisco, where he takes a job as a cook for 2 to 3 years. And then he comes down to San Diego in order to work on the railroad. At least that's what conventional wisdom has it. While he's back in San Diego, it looks like he picks up exactly where he was before, attending the mission schools. And he writes to his pastor up in San Francisco, Reverend Loomis, the missionary Reverend Loomis. And this came from one of the missionary annual reports. It's 1881, and I want you to notice the endearment, right? Aquin writes, "My dear friend and brother." So you can see a clear closeness between Aquin and Reverend Loomis, who he just really respects and has great affection for. Aquin is pleading for a mission for San Diego. He tells us the number is 20 boys, so it's up from 8, right? We saw in the last, just in 1878, that there were 8 boys, and now there are 20. And Aquin tells us he thinks there's enough. And another thing I want to ask you about, to open the Chinese mission school for San Diego. We are enough boys and more to come. So this is a direct request, an organic request from an attendee to a missionary to try to set up a satellite mission or another branch of a Chinese mission here in this locale. Now, it's not Reverend Loomis who answers the call. It is instead Reverend Pond, the Congregational missionary. Now, Reverend Pond was an incredibly energetic builder. He was the greatest builder of Chinese missions. He built 49 in his 50 years as a missionary. And he reveals later on in a talk that he gives that the origins of the San Diego mission were founded in part because there were two Christian Chinese who had already gone to reside in San Diego before the mission was established. He names one of them, Quan Nui, and Quan Nui does end up being a native teacher in the Chinese mission schools in San Diego. And then another who goes unnamed. But what Pond tells us about this second influencer is that he was one who was converted in connection with our work in Santa Barbara. And of course, Aquin was living in the mission, the Chinese mission in Santa Barbara that the Congregationalists had helped to set up. And I think Pond probably even appointed Aquin to work in that mission as kind of a house manager. So Pond knew Aquin, and Aquin visited Pond several times in San Francisco. It's also true that Reverend Pond knew Reverend Loomis. So whether Reverend Loomis told Reverend Pond, hey, I got this word from Aquin in San Diego that there's enough boys there for a new mission, or whether Aquin wrote to Reverend Pond directly because he knew him and we don't have the letter, we don't know. But what we do know is that it looks like Aquin, among others, may have suggested directly to missionaries in San Francisco, who were the leaders, that San Diego was ready for a Chinese mission of its own. And of course, this is the boom town. This is 1885. The railroad has been built. San Diego is doubling. There was every expectation that San Diego was going to be a home for many Chinese and many more non-Chinese. So Reverend Pond takes that initiative, and he comes down to San Diego with the intent of building a mission. The problem is that the Congregationalists did not yet have a church in San Diego. The Presbyterians didn't, in fact, have a formal synagogue. They had just a small chapel. So it looks to me like the Congregationalists and the Presbyterians get together for mutual benefit. And it's possible that Reverend Loomis or Reverend Pond up in San Francisco helped to facilitate that connection. It's also possible that George Marston is one who helped to facilitate this joint Chinese mission school, because again, George Marston was a member of both the Congregational as well as the Presbyterian churches. So the two churches unite and they build a Chinese mission right on the lot next to the Presbyterian church after having rented facilities in two other buildings for a year and a half, right? So between January 1885 and July 1886, they rent two facilities and they hold meetings, very regularly. I don't know how regularly, but regularly enough to have about 45 members of their church. In July of 1886, Pond takes a collection and he gets $300, and his headquarters donates 200 more. So for $500, he builds a building. It's a 50 by 25-foot building, and he builds it on the empty lot right next to the Presbyterian church, there on 8th and D Streets. The beauty of that is that it is open to all Presbyterians, Congregationalists, anyone who is interested in coming to the Chinese mission, and anyone who converts becomes a member of the Presbyterian congregation. So it has benefits for all parties, and the Chinese mission home there lasts for exactly 6 months. It's not a long time, unfortunately, even though there were 45 students enrolled. What happens is the Presbyterians are ready to build their own grand church on the corner of D and 8th, and they need the lot next door in order to transfer their own small mission. So they give the Congregationalists notice and let them know that they're ready to split and they want the Congregationalists to go elsewhere. Pond, because he is so devoted to his enterprise, takes his own money and he buys a lot of land on First Avenue. He has always been worried that this joint this joint Presbyterian Congregationalist Chinese mission here next to the Presbyterian Church is too far away from Chinatown in Pan's mind. Look, it's about 8 or 9 or 10 blocks away walking. And here this dotted line represents Chinatown with the star representing Ah Quin's house. So Pond really wants to migrate closer to Chinatown with the intent that that will help draw more attendance. And here he comes just a few blocks away, right here on First Avenue. And again, he uses his own money and he brings that 50 by 25-foot building with him and puts it on that lot. Their attendance doubles, right? It's about 45 at this point, and it has promise of growing larger, except that there are some complaints. I'm sorry. It grows to 45 at this, it doubles here to 105 from 45, which is what it had at the previous location. So it has 105 students as it's sitting here close to Chinatown. But the record says that only 20 students on average actually attend. And the huge gap in that helps to reveal how the Chinese felt about school, right? On the one hand, they thought it was the best opportunity ever, right? Free language lessons equals free job skills. So it's a wonderful opportunity for them to improve their hireability in America. But they also treated it somewhat casually, right? In some ways, it was an opportunity to hang out. You know, they could go, as Ah Quin describes, they could go with the guys over to Marston's house and have a lesson and then go out and eat. They could go over to Mrs. Gates' house and then, you know, go hang around in somebody's kitchen and cook, you know, some comfort food. So these are the kinds of things that they did. They didn't take it quite as seriously as I think the Protestants would have liked. I think they would have wanted them to be there every day as, you know, very diligent students. But again, the gap between 105 enrolled and 20 showing up more regularly shows us, again, the interest on the one hand, but also the casualness of the attendance. So the mission home lasts here for exactly a year. Again, not a long time, but the reasons now are that there are concerns about the women's safety. Chinatown is also right next to the Stingery, the red light district of San Diego, and that is by design, right? This is the lowest income section of town where Chinese are so often relegated. And so you see here at the front of the classroom, again, that it's the women, it's the wives and the daughters of the church leadership who are mostly teaching these Chinese classes. And in this Victorian age, there was a fear for their safety, as you can see from the cartoon, given the kind of propaganda that is circulating so widely. So the Chinese, again, need to think that the Protestants, Pond especially, needs to think again about whether he wants to close the mission or whether he wants to try to find a different venue. And I would just add to this again, the 1880s are the driving out years. The 1882 exclusion law has already been passed, but it seems to be not enough. It's not enough to stop Chinese from being able to enter America. A lot of the working class Americans, say those from the Working Men's Party, are still feeling like the Chinese who are here are depressing wages and taking jobs. So there is a large effort to try to drive whatever working class Chinese are already in the country back to China. And that happens by way of a number of violent pogroms, moments where vigilantes go into Chinatowns. Some 200 are recorded in just the mid 1880s alone. Something like 200 pogroms are recorded for vigilantes going in and trying to burn down Chinatowns or create riots to drive Chinese out, and even massacres. And I would note specifically in 1885, the murder of 28 Chinese at Rock Springs, Wyoming. In 1887, the murder of 34 Chinese gold miners who were ambushed at Hell's Canyon, Oregon. Even here in San Diego in 1885, there was a boycott, an anti-Chinese league that sponsored a boycott of companies who were hiring Chinese. It lasted for only a day or so, but the anti-Chinese league was also here. And even earlier in 1876, it had attempted to burn down Chinatown. So those forces were around. There were notices in the paper about no Chinese hires or whites only. So again, it was an environment that was often hostile to Chinese. And that made it difficult, again, for the Protestants to have any kind of relationship with them because of fears of public, um, you know, of the public not liking the Protestants as a result of them advocating for Chinese. So the Protestants were risking great criticism in their efforts to help convert and teach Chinese lessons, and especially because it was the wives and daughters. So because there were these fears, there was another threat to shut down this particular Chinese mission. But again, I think it's George Marston who comes to the rescue, and he donates a piece of land across town on 13th Avenue. So here on 13th Avenue, Reverend Pond moves across town, but what he gets in turn, in trade maybe, is a house. Right? He gets this back side of this home, which he can convert into 7 dormitory rooms that he can charge very low rent and therefore house single Chinese men. And he always envisioned and always wanted a residential facility. For him, that was the best way to help teach Chinese or really anyone about his religion. He thought if they're going out to Chinatown, they're being exposed to immorality and potentially being contaminated. So if he can just keep them sort of secluded in their own space, he felt like he had a much better chance of really bringing them to the word of his God. So he has this residential facility now, and he's very excited about it. They're able to stay there for 12 years. But when I tell you that they move, I don't just mean that they move rental facilities and rent somewhere else. They actually moved that building, that 50 by 20-foot building that they built next to the Presbyterian lot. They moved it not once, not twice, but 3 separate times. And you can see here, they went from First Avenue to this 13th Street Avenue. And I'm looking at Sanborn Fire Insurance maps now to see the footprint of the houses. You can see here on 13th that Pond gets, and you can see it says Chinese Mission School. He gets this add-on, this addendum, which he can hook to the house and create dormitories out of. And then when the railroad busts and Chinatown diminishes in size, he doesn't have enough people to sustain this mission, and he moves back to First Avenue and takes both buildings with him, right? And if you think that's crazy, and I did when I first heard it, I've learned that in fact this happened often in early San Diego. The History Center has given me these photos to illustrate. Here on the top photo, you see an entire house being moved by barge across Mission Bay. In the middle, you see an entire house, it looks like a Victorian style architecture, being put on the top of wagons and pulled by horse. And in the bottom, you see a house being moved by rail. So apparently, in an age where we didn't have maybe electricity and sewage pipes, you could pick up these wooden buildings, and maybe that was cheaper or easier than it was to try to build a whole new one. And you can just, again, you can imagine the devotion that these Protestants had, the enthusiasm, the dedication, the fervor. They could have stopped these mission homes at any time. Every time a hurdle comes up, they approach it as a challenge, and they take on that challenge and continue their enterprise. So again, I'm just, sort of amazed and impressed with the amount of energy that they put in to move the entire building. And then they have to move all the traffic in the town in order to get that building down the street and into its new place, and then somehow root it to a new foundation. I mean, it sounds like quite the enterprise. Okay, let's take just a minute to review where we've gone here. We've been talking about the two main mission homes, Chinese mission homes in San Diego, the Presbyterian and the Congregationalists. We've talked about the Congregationalists and the way in which they changed from a school-only facility to a school and home facility as part of their diversification and growth. Now let's talk about the Presbyterians. They see the Congregationalists developing a home and they think, okay, they've got that corner of the market. Let's move in a different direction. We're going to develop a children's school. And guess where they put it? Exactly 1 block from Ah Quin's house, right in the middle of Chinatown. So here we have Ah Quin, right? Here's the Chinatown boundaries. He's here on the corner of 3rd and J. The Presbyterian Chinese Mission School is developed 1 block away on 4th or so. And the reason perhaps they set up a children's school is because Ah Quin now has 5 children. There are only about 2 or 3 Chinese families in town, and his is the largest, and it will grow even more. In the next few years, he will have 7 more children. For the first 17 years of his marriage to Asu, they had a child about every year and a half, about every 18 months, and he eventually has 12 children. So the Presbyterians were well placed when they put their school a block away from Ah Quin. Ah Quin's children, only 3 of them go to school that first year, 3-year-old Mamie, 4-year-old George, and 6-year-old Annie, but they make up half of the 6-member class in the Chinese Mission Children's School during that very first year. So it's a really important development for the Ah Quin family, and the children's school will grow both to lower years as well as upper ages in order to better accommodate more and more of Ah Quin's family as he continues to have children. And again, there are 2 or 3 other families in Chinatown, and a few of their children also join. So this is a children's Chinese mission school, in addition to the adult Chinese mission school that the Presbyterians have. Let me tell you about their first day of school. Ah Quin actually writes about it. He says, today, mine George and Mamie first go to Miss Johnston's school just at 4th Street between I and J Street. And you can see some of his beautiful children there in the photo. This is incredibly significant. Why? Because just a few years earlier, Mamie Tape, a little Chinese girl in San Francisco, had sued the school board in order to attend public school in San Francisco. It was a landmark case, and she was in fact given permission to go to public school, but then shenanigans were played where she was then forced to go into a segregated public school. And that became kind of the modus operandi for Chinese, for African Americans, for some Native Americans. And you can imagine that Ah Quin was watching this. The San Diego Union locally printed updates about the Mamie Tape case. So Ah Quin was certainly watching it. And we think he had great admiration for Mamie because the next daughter he had in 1886, he named after her. He named that daughter Mamie, and that's the one you see here in the quote. So think about the Ah Quin family now for a moment. They are living in the gas lamp quarter, what we call the gas lamp quarter here in San Diego, which at the time was called the Stingery or Chinatown. They are largely isolated, right? There's only 1 or 2 or 3 Chinese families there, and it is not a good section of town. So you can imagine that the children are mostly kept in the house for their own safety, not only because it's the red light district, because it's also a hostile moment for Chinese. But Ah Quin and Asu are native Cantonese speakers. So they are probably speaking Cantonese in the home. So the children probably are not having a lot of exposure to the English language. They are certainly not having a lot of exposure to American people, right? They may see 1 or 2 come by to hire, some workers, but they are not getting a lot of exposure outside of their home, again, for their own safety in many ways. If Aquin decides to send them to a public school. And the law has said, as it did with the Mamie Case ruling, if the majority of people in that school protest, then the Chinese must go to a colored school. The city must set up a separate, segregated public school for Chinese. So this must have been horrifying for Aquin. He felt himself a town leader. He took a great deal of pride in being someone that was respected as a liaison between the white community and the Chinese community. He was a labor broker, so this was part of his livelihood. To be shamed in that way, if his children went to school and the people voted against him, would have been very, very hard for him to bear. He was in a very precarious situation, so much so that he talked openly about sending his children back to China for education, which many Chinese did, right? He thought, well, maybe he needs to send George and Annie, the two oldest, back to the village in China at the time his parents were still alive so that they could have a more traditional education. So this was a tough choice for him, but he loved his children. He was very, very endearing to them. Even in the middle of the night, when a child would wake him up crying, he would call him dearest Tommy or dearest George and get up to make them something to eat. So he loved his children, and I think he really couldn't bear to be apart from them, which is why he was very grateful for the children's school right around the corner. And in fact, again, he always called his home church the Presbyterian Church. So it's very possible that the Presbyterian Church deliberately went to cater to some of the Aquin family needs by growing and diversifying in this particular direction. And it served as a soft transition for the children, right? They were able to go to this Chinese children's school and learn some of the English language, but they also were able to watch these Victorian teachers and their customs and courtesies, and in that way learn some of the American traditions. The Victorian teachers took them home, took the Chinese home with them for Thanksgiving. So the kids were introduced to turkey legs and Christmas presents. And so it was really a kind of wonderful opportunity for the children to begin to assimilate with this soft transition through these very caring Protestant leaders. So again, it was a wonderful opportunity, I think, for the Chinese, and one for which Aquin was eternally grateful, I think. It allowed all of his children eventually to matriculate into public high schools. I think all of the boys graduated from Russ High School here in San Diego. I think the girls made it up to about 8th grade, and then some went to a business college to learn like secretarial skills. But they all were able to assimilate into American life, in part as a result of this early soft start and the fact that they weren't shamed in having to go to, some sort of a colored school, or, have the city resent them for having to fund a whole separate enterprise. Okay. The Presbyterians had a second Chinese mission at the same time, and it was right here next to the church itself, and it was actually this little chapel building. This was the very first Presbyterian church. Once they built the larger sanctuary, they gave this chapel over to the Chinese, and in the Sanborn maps, it's labeled as the Chinese Mission School. Now we can see again from Aquin in 1891 that Reverend Noble wants the Chinese boys to buy the building. And Aquin tells us in his diary that about 30 of the boys actually contributed, and they had enough money to buy the building, but they eventually decide not to. And I think what's going on there is that the Presbyterian Church is asking the Chinese, trying to push them towards becoming self-sufficient. And as the Chinese talk about it, it sounds like they're not quite ready to inherit that level of responsibility. And I think that's the story that Aquin is telling us in his diary. That brings us to the 1890s, which in San Diego is the height of the Chinese mission movement. And we know that because Reverend Pond writes in one of his speeches that there are 4 Chinese missions in San Diego at that time, and they are competing like rivals. They are, just going at each other with attempts to get attendance, because at this point, the railroad is just about to bust, and the the population of San Diego is going to tank, as is the Chinese population. So in these 10 years, a lot happens. But before everything tanks, the Baptists come in, and here you can see they build 2 Chinese missions right next to their 2 churches and try to make a go at it. The Methodists come in, and they are right in the heart of Chinatown. So much so that they are taking over the very same facilities that the previous Chinese missions are inhabiting. So, for instance, we're told at one point that the Presbyterians have a Chinese mission in this building, which has now become a famous historic building. It is 428 3rd Avenue. And we're told that the Presbyterians may have at one point had a Chinese mission in this building, which the Methodists then took over, which then the Voying Gong took over, this other type of Chinese mission, which I'll talk about in just a few minutes. It was so contentious that their rivalries broke out into the congregation. And again, Aquin tells us about a difficult episode. Here in 1892, the Methodists have come to town, and they have asked Aquin whether or not his children can come sing at the Methodist Episcopal Church. And Aquin very much wants to honor the request. He wants to, sort of in that brotherly way, he wants to allow his children to go and entertain and be, a giving part of the community. But he feels an allegiance to the Presbyterian Church, again, because they're hosting the Chinese children's school. And so he goes to that pastor, Reverend Noble, and he asks him, do you mind if my kids go sing at the Methodist Church on Sunday? And Reverend Noble says, no, no. And the Methodists come back in the diary and ask him, please, it's all right. Hey, this is your kids. You can do it. And they put a lot of pressure on him. And he goes back to Reverend Noble's house and says, please, would you mind? Would it be okay? And twice, Reverend Noble says, no. And Aquin tells us in his diary, because children of mine belong to our church, Presbyterian. And he also goes and he talks to the children's school teacher just to get as many opinions as he possibly could. So again, it's difficult but understandable the way that the church rivalries would directly and negatively eventually affect the Chinese. But it's sad. These are competing evangelists, and that collaborative environment that we saw earlier in San Diego, and especially with the joint Chinese missions between the Congregationalists and the Presbyterians, no longer exists in this environment. It is a dog eat dog, every church for himself, try to get whatever attendance you can in order to stay alive. Eventually, all of these missions fold except for the Congregationalists, and we'll talk about them in just a few minutes. What we see in San Diego, as we're zooming out, is that there were 5 Chinese missions, not just one, as conventional wisdom would have it. There were multiple branches of a Presbyterian Chinese mission, again with the children's school as well as the adult. The Congregational Chinese Mission School also had a home with residential facilities. The Baptists came in at least on 2 occasions and set up a couple of branches of mission schools. The Methodist Episcopalians came in very aggressively and set up a mission school. And then this Voying Gong Su Chinese mission, which is so curious, right? The name itself is curious. It looks like the Voying Gong Su began as a Chinese company and then maybe morphed into a Joss house, some kind of a Chinese temple at one point, and maybe even a political Freemason organization, one that maybe a political one to try to fight the emperor in China, and maybe even gangsters. It may have even housed Tong members, but it looks to me like they're using the term Chinese mission maybe as a way to be a little bit more accepted in an American society, kind of appropriating that language, even though I don't think they were a Protestant church. I'm not quite sure what kind of church they were. I think it's a very interesting nomenclature that shows up that I think deserves a lot more research, as much of this does. If we zoom out, what we can see from the Protestant movement is a huge toolkit, right? All different ways to help Chinese immigrants assimilate, improve their job prospects, and both intentionally and unintentionally challenge this vile, horrific stereotype that was circulating so often about Chinese and these boundaries that were coming into American immigration law. There are always criticisms of evangelists, right? And the efforts of evangelists with the idea that they're coercing or imposing religious and spiritual beliefs on people who are disempowered. But I want to make clear that the Chinese here had a choice, right? They weren't captured, they weren't cordoned off. Even the women in the rescue homes had a choice about whether or not to stay and whether or not to convert. And that's a very important point. It's also important to note that of all the energy that the evangelists put forward, they had very, very few conversions in return. So they didn't really get their wish. By my very rough calculations, something like only 1 or 2% of the men who attended Chinese mission school classes, English classes, actually converted. And only a handful actually went back to China that we know of and helped to spread the word. Among the women who were in the residential mission homes, I would calculate maybe 7 or 8%, so a higher percentage. But still, in comparison to the enormous amount of effort that they made, there were very, very few conversions, which makes their effort all the more impressive, I think. I want to leave you with some takeaways. The 5 contributions, the 5 most important contributions that I can see that the Protestant Chinese mission home movement made, at least here in San Diego and in some other cities, is number 1, the biggest one, the gift of the English language lesson for free, right? And I estimate probably tens of thousands of Chinese actually attended at least one English language class. Again, when you see the disparity between the number who are enrolled and the number who actually attend every day, you can see the kind of casualness with which many took these classes. But I would guess that probably tens of thousands attended at least one class. What's not to like? They were free, they were, close to home, they were with their friends, and they were learning an important job skill that could help them get ahead. And I can tell you, especially in Ah Quin's case, just as one example, learning English in San Francisco in the Chinese mission home allowed him later to become a bilingual labor recruiter for the railroad in San Diego. It allowed him to be a translator in the court in San Diego, which allowed him to meet a number of judges. When Chinese then came to Ah Quin with problems, he could go to the judges not only for advocacy, but also for advice, which was an incredible gift for him to be an effective liaison between the white community and the Chinese community, eventually allowing him not only to be named the informal mayor of San Diego's Chinatown, but also to live a middle-class lifestyle, as you can see here later in his life with Ah Soo. It's also true that Chinese who were more easily able to communicate and understand American culture were perhaps better tolerated by those who might be otherwise hostile to immigrants or those they considered foreign. So by and far, the English language skills were certainly the number one contribution. And again, I mentioned that one metaphor is they're kind of a lost leader, right? In terms of like that grocery store analogy. They had an incredible amount of effort in them, but I think the Protestants didn't get quite as much in return there. Contribution number 2, assimilation assistance for children, and his children in particular, but other Chinese children, because San Francisco had a Chinese children's school. Some of the other larger Chinatowns had Chinese children's schools, and certainly this beautiful family, I think, benefited tremendously by having this soft transition and not taking the risk or having it come to fruition that they would have to be in a segregated colored school with all the potential shame and animus that might come with that. So assimilation contribution. Third, the Christian leaders were the only reliable advocates that Chinese had. And on the far left, William Spear and Reverend Loomis testified in congressional hearings in San Francisco against the Chinese exclusion law. If they weren't testifying and advocating for Chinese, those exclusion laws may have been even worse. Otis Gibson in the middle, the Methodist preacher, he also testified in some of those congressional hearings. A paper figure of him was burned in effigy in 1877 in one of the San Francisco riots. I mean, that must have been just terrifying, to think that these out of control crowds of Americans like him were burning a figure of him in effigy with that much hate, that much animus because of his cooperation with Chinese. So again, these missionaries, these leaders advocated for Chinese even at self-sacrifice. And here's George Marston on the far right, who gave that piece of land to the Congregational Church, which allowed them then to continue their efforts in a residential facility, and also probably facilitated the joint efforts between the Presbyterians and the Congregationalists early on during that joint missionary movement. So yeah, there are very few advocates for Chinese, but reliably the church leaders were advocates. And again, if they hadn't been speaking to their brethren, to other whites, the anti-Chinese laws may have been even much worse. Oops, I think I missed one. Okay, contribution number 4, and this is my favorite. The success of the Congregational Chinese Mission. It was the one that was left standing after all of those years. And as you'll see in my next slide, in 1946, the Chinese mission school movement ends because the Congregational Chinese Mission, the last one standing, turns into a self-supporting church. It does that by way of growth. So you can see in 1909, it is still at that First Avenue address with those 2 houses sort of, pasted back together after having been moved from 13th Avenue. In 1927, they decide to tear down that wooden structure and build a beautiful adobe structure that now can house 18. There are 18 dormitory rooms in this beautiful adobe structure, and they outgrow it too, right? In the in the 1940s, the Brides Act come about, and we begin to see many more Chinese women coming in and families growing. So the church is thriving there on First Avenue, so much so that they need to move. And they buy a much larger facility on 47th Street in 1960. And then again, it grows so large that they need to build a new gorgeous facility in a Tierra Santa suburb in 2006, where that church is currently located. So this is one of Pon's great success stories. Only 3 of Reverend Pon's 49 missions actually went all the way to become the self-sustaining church that was his goal for every single one. And San Diego's was one, right? San Francisco Bethany, his own sort of home chapel, became a self-sustaining church. And then the Chinese mission, the Congregational Chinese Mission in Berkeley, became a self-sustaining church. So only 3. And San Diego has one of those jewels for Reverend Pond, and that is certainly a great contribution to the Chinese community. It allowed the Chinese community here in San Diego to have a very stable resource, and for that, that community has sustained itself very long, even until this day. And the 5th contribution, this is also a wonderful story. There was a grassroots protest, essentially. Developer Charles Tyson in 1993 owned this. He bought the piece of land and owned this Congregational Chinese Mission, and he wanted to destroy it. And there was a grassroots uprising among the Chinese community from people like Tom Hom and his wife Dorothy Hom. Tom Hom being kind of a 20th century Aquin figure, the first Chinese councilman in San Diego, and someone who really helped to design the Asian Pacific Historic District and to save this church facility. They protested, and they eventually got Charles Tyson to donate the front part of the Congregational Chinese Mission to a newly formed San Diego Chinese Historical Society. The San Diego City then donated a piece of land that was right on the corner of the main part of Chinatown, right where Aquin used to live on J and 3rd Street, where they could then put this building. And we have had it ever since as a wonderful multicultural contribution to our city. And this organization puts on New Year's celebrations every year. It has dragon boat races. It sponsors Asian Pacific historic tours around that area, and it supports talks like this to, again, enrich our community with the Chinese heritage that we have had for so long. So in the end, and this is the poster for this talk, in the end, the Chinese mission home legacy in San Diego is a long-standing and stable Chinese community here. Thank you very much.